The maintenance log said the aquarium was empty after closing. I signed that log every night for 11 months. I am the reason nobody believed the boy who said he heard voices in the back tanks. And I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened. Because I'm done pretending I didn't know. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is that I was the overnight facilities tech at a mid-sized public aquarium on the bay side of an old industrial waterfront, not one of the famous ones. We had maybe 40 exhibit tanks, a research wing the public never saw, and a basement level we called the gallery, which was where the life support systems for the whole building lived. Pumps, chillers, the protein skimmers, the ozone reactors, the quarantine holding tanks, miles of PVC and gray pipe. If you have ever stood behind the scenes at a place like that, you know it doesn't smell like the ocean. It smells like wet concrete and salt that has dried and gotten wet again 1,000 times, and faintly like the chemical they use to keep the algae down. That smell is in my clothes still. I have washed everything twice. It doesn't come out. I took the job because I needed something steady and quiet and overnight. My daughter was 4 when her mother and I split, and the custody arrangement meant I had her 3 days a week, daytime, which I could not do if I worked normal hours. Nights at the aquarium meant I slept while she was in pre-K, and I was awake and present the days I had her. That was the whole logic of my life back then. I built everything around those 3 days. I want you to understand that, because later, when I tell you the choices I made, I need you to understand that I was a man who had organized his entire existence around being available for one small person, and that even so, when the moment came, I chose to keep my head down. The work itself was simple, and I was good at it. I'd come in at 10, after the cleaning crew finished, and before the last researcher went home. I'd do a walkthrough of all the public galleries with a flashlight, checking water levels in the overflow boxes, listening to the pumps, watching for any tank that had gone cloudy or any temperature alarm that hadn't cleared. Then I'd go down to the gallery and do my real rounds. Check the chillers were holding set point, backwash the sand filters on a rotation, top off the dosing reservoirs, log everything on a clipboard, and then again in the computer. By 2 in the morning, I usually had nothing to do but sit in the little break room off the loading dock and wait for anything to break, which on most nights, nothing did. I was alone for most of the shift, but not all of it. There was a security guard named Royce who worked the same hours, an older guy, ex-merchant marine, big and slow and kind. He did his own rounds on a separate schedule, and we'd cross paths a few times a night, usually at the loading dock door where he'd prop it with a fire extinguisher to smoke, even though he wasn't supposed to. And on the research side, there was a woman named Dr. Halverson, who kept hours nobody could explain. She ran the quarantine and the breeding programs, and some nights she'd be in her office at 3 in the morning, and other nights I wouldn't see her for a week. She had a key card that went places mine didn't. She was polite to me in the way that very busy people are polite, which is to say she remembered my name, but never anything I said. The thing you have to understand about the building is that it had been added onto over decades. The original structure was a fish packing plant from before the war. They'd gutted it in the 90s and built the public aquarium into the shell. And then around 2010, they'd added the research wing onto the back, over the old slipway where boats used to come in to unload catch. That slipway was still there, underneath everything. Flooded, of course, sealed off, but there. We had a sump down in the lowest part of the gallery that pumped out the groundwater and tidal seep that came up through the old slip, because the whole back third of the building was technically below the water line at high tide. There were 3 sump pumps on a float switch rotation. As long as 2 of them worked, we were fine. I checked them every night. I want that on the record. I checked them every single night. And for 11 months, they did exactly what they were supposed to. The first thing that was wrong, I almost didn't notice. And when I did notice it, I had a reasonable explanation, which is how these things always start. It was a Tuesday in late October. I was doing my upstairs walkthrough, and I came through the deep reef gallery, which was the big one, the showpiece. A 2-story tank, almost 100,000 gallons, with a viewing tunnel you could walk through at the bottom. At night, the main lights were off, and only the dim blue moon cycle LEDs were on inside the tank. So the water glowed faintly, and everything outside the glass was black. I'd walked that gallery 1,000 times. I knew the sound of it. The big tank had a particular hum from its return pumps, and a soft trickle from the overflow, and that was it. That night, there was a tapping. Not loud, slow, irregular, like someone tapping a fingernail on glass, but spaced out, with long gaps. I stopped in the tunnel and listened. My first thought was that a piece of equipment had come loose somewhere, a flapper valve or a check valve chattering, because in a system that big, there's always something working its way loose. I put my hand flat on the acrylic to feel for vibration. The tapping stopped. I stood there maybe 2 minutes, nothing. I figured I'd imagined the location, that it was carrying from somewhere else in the building, the way sound does in a concrete structure at night. I made a note on my clipboard to check the valves on the reef system, and I moved on. I did check them, down in the gallery, an hour later. Every valve was seated. Every pump was running clean. There was nothing loose. I wrote "No issue found" next to my earlier note, and I forgot about it, the way you forget about a sound you can't reproduce. 3 nights later, it was back, and this time, Royce heard it too. We were both in the deep reef gallery, which was unusual because our rounds didn't normally overlap there. He'd come up to tell me the loading dock door sensor was throwing a fault, and he wanted me to look at it. And while we were standing there talking, the tapping started up. Royce stopped mid-sentence. He was a hard man to surprise. He'd spent 20 years on cargo ships, and he had that flat affect that guys who've seen real emergencies get. But he went quiet, and he turned his head toward the tank, and he said, "You hear that?" I said, "Yeah." I said I'd heard it a few nights back and figured it was a valve. He listened for a while. Then he said something I didn't understand at the time and that I have thought about every day since. He said, "That's not a valve. That's somebody asking to be let in." I laughed, because what else do you do? I told him he'd been on ghost ships too long. He didn't laugh. He just looked at the dark water for a second, and then he said, "Show me the door fault." And we went and looked at the loading dock sensor, and he never brought up the tapping again. But I noticed after that, he stopped propping the loading dock door with the fire extinguisher. He'd close it all the way and check the latch twice. A man who'd been breaking that rule for years suddenly started following it, and he never told me why. I should have asked. That's the first place I could have done something different. I want to be honest about every one of these moments, because there were a lot of them. And at each one I had the chance to be a different kind of man. And at each one I chose the comfortable thing. The next escalation was the water. I told you about the sump. 3 pumps, float switch rotation, keeping the old flooded slipway from coming up into the gallery. About a week after the tapping started, I noticed during my rounds that the sump level was higher than it should have been. Not dangerously, just higher than the set point where the lead pump was supposed to kick on. I went and looked at the pump, and it was running fine, moving water. But the level wasn't dropping the way it should. I figured the impeller was fouled or the discharge line was partly clogged, which happens, especially with all the biological material in the building like that. I made a note to pull the pump and clean it on my next slow night. But here's the part that bothered me, and that I talked myself out of. The water in the sump was the wrong color. The seep that came up from the old slip was always a little brown, tannic, with that organic tea look that brackish coastal water gets. That night, it was clear. Clear and cold-looking, with a faint blue cast under my flashlight, like the water in the exhibit tanks. I stood there, and I told myself it was a trick of the light, that the new LED on my flashlight had a cooler temperature than my old one, that I was tired. All of those things were technically true. None of them was the real explanation, and some part of me knew it, because I remember dipping my finger in, and it was colder than groundwater should be. Much colder. And I wiped my hand on my pants, and I left. And I did not write down anything about the color or the temperature. I wrote, sump lead pump sluggish, schedule maintenance. That was the second place I could have done something. The personal thing happened in the middle of all this, and it's the reason I kept going to work instead of quitting, which in hindsight a smarter man would have done. My daughter started having a recurring dream. She was 5 by then. On my days with her, she'd wake up and tell me about it over breakfast in the matter-of-fact way little kids report dreams, like they're reading you the weather. She said there were people behind glass who wanted to talk to her. She said they had wet hair, and they pressed their hands flat, and they were trying to tell her something, but she couldn't hear it through the glass. She wasn't scared of them. That was the strange part. She said they were sad, and that she felt bad she couldn't help them. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. And I'm not telling you my 5-year-old had some psychic connection to my workplace. Kids dream about all kinds of things. She'd been to the aquarium with me on a public day once. She'd walked through the tunnel, she'd seen me press my hand to the glass and point things out to her. Of course, she dreamed about people behind glass. But she had never, not once, been to the gallery or the sump or the research wing. And the detail that stuck in me, that I couldn't reason away, was the wet hair. She kept saying the wet hair. She said it like it was the most important part. I told her it was just a dream. I told her the people behind the glass at the aquarium were just pictures, and that the only real things behind glass were fish, and they were all very happy. She accepted that the way kids accept things, completely and then not at all, because she kept having the dream. Her mother mentioned it to me once during a handoff, asked if I'd been telling her scary stories, accused me a little, the way exes do. I said I hadn't. I changed the subject. I went to work that night and I did my rounds, and the tapping was there again in the deep reef gallery. And I stood in the tunnel, and for the first time, I said out loud, "I can't help you." And then I felt like an idiot for talking to a fish tank, and I finished my rounds. Now I have to tell you about Dr. Halverson and the quarantine, because that's where the official version of events and the real version split apart. And I was standing right at the seam. The quarantine system was a row of holding tanks in the research wing, off limits to me. Fish and invertebrates that came in from collectors or from other facilities got held there for observation before they went on display, to make sure they weren't carrying disease or parasites. It had its own life support, separate from the main system, with its own chillers and its own little sump. The only reason I ever went in there was if a quarantine alarm tripped and Halverson wasn't on site, in which case I was supposed to call her cell and then do whatever she told me over the phone. That happened maybe twice in my whole time there. In early November, the quarantine started throwing alarms almost every night. Temperature alarms, mostly. The chillers couldn't hold set point. I'd call Halverson and she'd be short with me and tell me she was aware of it and to silence the alarm and not touch anything. Which was fine. That was her system, not mine. But it kept happening. And the thing that started to bother me was that the temperature it was trending toward was wrong. Quarantine for our kind of livestock was kept in the low 70s, tropical. The alarms were because the water was getting colder, much colder. One night the readout on the panel said 51 degrees and dropping. And I called Halverson and told her, and there was a long pause on the line. And then she said, "That's correct, silence it." And she hung up. That's correct. 51 degrees in a tropical quarantine tank, dropping. And she said that's correct. I want to tell you I pushed. I want to tell you I walked into that quarantine room and looked. But my badge didn't open that door, and Halverson outranked everyone in the building at night. And I had a daughter and a job and a custody arrangement that depended on the job. And a researcher being weird about her own experiment did not seem like my problem. So I silenced the alarm, and I went back downstairs and I checked my sump, which was still the wrong color, clear and blue and cold, and rising slowly. And I told myself those two things were not connected, even though some animal part of my brain had already connected them and was screaming about it from a room I'd locked. The coworker who acted too normal was Halverson, but it was also a new guy. About this time, management hired a second overnight person, supposedly to help me with the increased maintenance load, which I'd been documenting in my logs. His name was Petrov, or that's what his badge said. He showed up one night already trained, already badged, with access to areas I didn't have access to, including the quarantine and the research wing. Nobody introduced him to me. I found him in the gallery at 1 a.m, checking the sump, my sump, with a meter I didn't recognize. And when I asked who he was, he told me his name and that he was the new tech, and went right back to what he was doing. He was friendly enough. Too friendly, in the way that doesn't leave any space for real questions. If I asked him what he was measuring, he'd say, "Just baselines," and smile and ask me about my weekend. If I asked him who he reported to, he'd say, "Same as you, I think," and change the subject. He worked the same hours I did, but I never saw him do any of the actual maintenance. He never backwashed a filter or topped off a reservoir or pulled a pump. He just took readings all over the building with that meter, and he spent a lot of time in the research wing with Halverson behind doors I couldn't open. And he was always perfectly calm. The building was developing problems that scared me, and he moved through it like a man checking inventory at a hardware store. One night, I made the mistake of mentioning the tapping to him. I figured he'd heard it. He was all over the building. I asked him casually in the break room if he'd noticed any weird sounds in the deep reef gallery. And for just a second, his face did something. The friendly thing dropped off it, and underneath was something flat and attentive, and he said, "What kind of sounds?" Not as a question, as a thing he needed to know the answer to. And I felt, for the first time, actually afraid of a person in that building. And I backed off and said it was probably just a valve. And he watched me for a second, and then the friendly face came back on. And he said valves can be tricky, and asked if I wanted half his sandwich. I didn't take the sandwich. I went and did my rounds, and I avoided him for the rest of the night. And from then on, I kept my logs vaguer on purpose, because I had the sense, without being able to justify it, that what I wrote down was being read by someone who didn't want me writing certain things down. The water kept rising in the sump. By mid-November, the level was a foot above where it should have been, even with all 3 pumps running constantly, which they now were. I pulled the lead pump and cleaned it, and the impeller was fine, no fouling. And when I put it back, it moved water just like it should, and the level still didn't drop. Which is not possible. If 3 pumps are moving water out faster than it can come in, the level goes down. The only way the level stays up is if more water is coming in than I thought. A lot more, from somewhere. And the only place it could come from was the old, flooded slipway underneath the building, which meant something down there had changed, some seal or some channel. And the slip was filling the building from below faster than I could pump it out. I reported this. I want that on the record too. I filed a maintenance ticket, the formal kind, in the system, that said the sump inflow had increased beyond pump capacity, and that we needed to get a diver or a camera into the old slipway to find out why. I escalated it to my supervisor, a daytime guy named Coyle who I rarely saw. And the ticket came back closed within a day, marked inspected, no action required, with a note that said the inflow was within seasonal norms and attributed to high tides. I knew that was a lie. There were no high tides that week. I checked, and nobody had inspected anything overnight, because I was the only one there overnight, except Royce and Petrov. And neither of them had been into the sump access with me. Somebody had closed my ticket from a desk without ever looking, and they'd written down a reason that was provably false. And the system had accepted it and filed it and moved on. That was the night I understood that the building was lying, not the people, although the people were too. The building, the logs, the tickets, the alarms, the official record of what was happening inside it. All of it had quietly come loose from what was actually happening inside it. And I was the only one standing in the gap between the record and the real thing. And the record was winning. I started keeping my own notes after that, on paper at home. Real ones. The watercolor, the temperature, the dates, the tapping, the dream my daughter kept having, the things Petrov said. I don't know who I thought I was keeping them for. Myself, I guess. Some future version of me who'd be able to prove he wasn't crazy. The personal message came on a Thursday, on one of my days with my daughter. And it's the thing that finally got me to do something. And it's also the thing I'll regret to the end of my life, because by the time I acted, it was already too late, and acting only put me in the path of it. She drew me a picture. She was always drawing, taped them all over my refrigerator. This one she made special, she said, for me to take to work. It was the people behind the glass. A row of them, with their hands flat against a blue rectangle, and the wet hair coming down in straight lines, and she'd drawn their mouths open. And in the corner, in the careful backwards letter way kids that age write, she'd written a word. She'd asked her mother how to spell it, apparently, which is how I later confirmed she really had been told it and hadn't made it up. The word was cold. I asked her why the people were cold. She said because they were in the cold water, of course, in the tone that meant I was being slow. I asked her how she knew. And she looked at me. My 5-year-old looked at me across her cereal and she said, "The man told me. The man who isn't a man. He stands behind you at your work and he listens to everything." And then she went back to eating her cereal like she hadn't just described Petrov, who she had never seen, who she had no way of knowing existed, standing behind me at a job she'd never visited. I am not a superstitious person. I need you to understand that I have spent a year trying to find the ordinary explanation for that. And I can build one. I can tell you about how kids absorb our stress and reflect it back. About how I must have mentioned a new coworker. About coincidence and the way the human mind finds patterns. I can build that explanation, and it almost holds. But I looked at that drawing, the cold people with their hands on the glass and their open mouths. And I looked at my daughter. And for the first time in my adult life, I was afraid in a way that had nothing to do with my job or my custody arrangement or my paycheck. I was afraid the way an animal is afraid. And I made a decision that I was going to find out what was in the quarantine and what was in the slipway. Even though both of those things were behind doors, my badge wouldn't open, because I was not going to let whatever it was get any closer to her. That was the bravest thing I did in the whole story. It's also the only brave thing I did, and I did it too late, and everything after it is me failing. I went in early that night, before Royce, before Petrov. While there was still one researcher finishing up on the public side, I went down to the gallery and I went to the sump access, which was a steel hatch in the floor of the lowest room, bolted, leading down a short ladder to the actual sump pit in the mouth of the old slipway. I had the right to open that hatch. It was the one below-grade access my job actually included. I'd been down it a dozen times for routine pump work. I unbolted it and I lifted it, and I went down with my flashlight, expecting to see the sump pit and the dark flooded mouth of the slip beyond it. The sump pit was dry, bone dry. Not a sluggish pump, not a rising level. Dry like it hadn't held water in days, which made no sense, because the panel upstairs said the level was a foot high and all three pumps were running. And the mouth of the slipway, which should have been a black flooded opening leading out under the building toward the bay, was not flooded. The water had gone down, way down. The old slip stretched out in front of me, a long concrete channel going back under the foundation into the dark. And instead of being full, it was nearly empty. Just a few inches of that clear, blue, cold water on the bottom. And it went back farther than my flashlight could reach. And the air coming out of it was cold, refrigerator cold, sea cold. And it smelled like the deep part of the ocean, like a place that never sees the sun. And far back in the dark, at the edge of where my light died, the few inches of water on the floor of the slip were moving. Not flowing, disturbed, like something the length of the channel had just gone still when my light hit it, and was waiting, the way the tapping always stopped the second I put my hand on the glass. I heard the hatch above me, the bolt. Someone had come into the room above and was closing the hatch I'd come down through. I scrambled back up the ladder and got my hand against it before it sealed, and through the gap I saw Petrov's boots, and Petrov's voice said, calm as ever, "You weren't supposed to see the slip yet. It's not finished filling." And he wasn't talking about the water. I held that hatch with both hands, and I think the only reason it didn't seal all the way was that Petrov wasn't really trying. That's what I understood later. He could have stood on it. He could have called the cold thing in the slip up the channel toward me. He did neither. He just held it half closed against my fingers and talked to me through the gap in that flat, patient voice, the way you'd talk to a child who'd wandered into a room he wasn't supposed to be in. He told me to come up slow. He told me nobody was going to hurt me, that nobody had ever wanted to hurt me, that I'd been useful and quiet, and that those were the two things they needed. And he stepped back and let the hatch go, and I came up out of that hole and stood there in the lowest room of the gallery, soaked to the knees in that cold blue water that had splashed up the ladder, facing a man I'd worked beside for 2 weeks and never once understood. I asked him what was in the slip. He said I'd already seen it. I asked him what it was, and he gave me an answer that I have turned over 1,000 times, because it was the only straight thing he ever said to me, and it explained everything and nothing. He said the building had been built over a door, and the door had always leaked a little, and that for as long as there'd been a packing plant and then an aquarium on that site, a small number of people had been employed, quietly, to manage the leak. Not to close it. You couldn't close it. To manage it. To keep the level right. He said the sump pumps weren't keeping water out of the building. They were keeping water in the slip. They were keeping the door wet on the right side. And something had shifted in the last few months. The way the ground shifts. the way tides change over decades, and the door was opening wider, and the slip was draining the wrong way, out toward the cold place. And when it finished draining, the door would be fully open, and the people who managed it wanted to be sure that when that happened, the building was quiet and the record was clean, and nobody on the outside was asking questions. That's what the tapping was, he said. The ones who'd already gone through, on the other side of the glass, in the cold. He said it the way you'd describe a known feature of a building, a draft, a settling foundation. He said they tap because they want to come back, and they can't. And the only ones who can hear them are the ones the cold has already started to study. Children mostly, and people who spend too long alone, in the building at night. I thought about my daughter and her dream, and her drawing, and the word cold in backward letters. And I think Petrov saw it on my face, because he said in almost gently, "Your kid's been listening for a while. They like the young ones. The young ones still answer. I want to tell you I hit him. I want to tell you I did anything at all. What I actually did was ask him what they wanted from me, because at that point I was a man trying to find the exit. And the only exit I could see ran through giving them whatever they needed to leave my daughter alone. He said they didn't want anything from me. That was the whole horror of it, looking back. I wasn't important. I was a maintenance tech who'd noticed some things and written some tickets, and the tickets had been closed and the things had been managed. And now I'd seen the slip a little early, and the only question on the table was whether I was going to be quiet like Royce, or whether I was going to be a problem. He said Royce had figured it out years ago on a previous opening before my time. That's why Royce checked the latch twice now. That's why Royce had stopped propping the door. Royce had decided to be quiet and keep his pension and not look at the slip. And Royce was going to be fine. He said I could be Royce. Most people chose to be Royce. And then he told me the part that changed the meaning of everything that had happened. And I've never been able to put it down since. He said the quarantine wasn't quarantine. The cold tanks in the research wing, the ones Halverson kept dropping below 50 degrees. The ones I'd silenced the alarms on night after night because she told me that's correct. Those weren't holding fish. They were holding the ones who'd come part way back. The ones the cold had returned. Not all the way, not alive the way you'd mean it, but enough. The wet hair, the hands on the glass. Halverson wasn't a researcher running a breeding program. She was a keeper. She kept the part-way ones cold and quiet and behind glass, in the dark, in the back of a building nobody questioned. Because that was the deal that kept the door manageable. You give the cold a place to put the ones it sends back. And it doesn't come up through the floor looking for more. Every alarm I'd silenced. Every, "That's correct." Every night I'd stood in the gallery and heard the tapping and told myself it was a valve and walked away. I'd been doing the job. I'd been part of the management of the leak the whole time and never known it. And the not knowing had been the point. They didn't need me to believe. They needed me to silence the alarm and close the hatch and write money like no issue found. A man who knows what he's doing might quit or talk. A man who's just doing maintenance keeps the door wet forever and never asks what's behind it. I asked him about my daughter again. I couldn't stop. He said the dreams would stop on their own once the door finished opening. Because once it was open, the ones behind the glass wouldn't need to tap anymore. They'd have a way through. And the young ones they'd been calling wouldn't be needed as a route. He said it like that was reassuring. He said the only ones in danger during an opening were the ones in the building, the ones outside, the children answering from their beds across town. They were just being listened to. They were safe as long as they stayed away from the slip. and I made my first real choice, standing in that cold water. And it was a choice to leave, not to fight, not to expose anyone, not to call for help, to go home to my daughter, who was with her mother that night, and to stay away from the building, and to let it open and close, or do whatever it was going to do, and to never come back. I told Petrov I'd be Royce. I told him I wanted the pension and the quiet, and he looked at me for a long moment, and I think he actually believed me, because I think I actually meant it, and he stepped aside and let me walk to the stairs. That was the moment I could have done the right thing and didn't. And I want to be precise about it, because the next part is the part I can't forgive. On my way up through the building, I passed the research wing and the door to it was standing open. It never stood open. Halverson kept it sealed. But it was open, and the lights inside were the dim red of a night cycle. And I could see down the corridor to the row of cold tanks. And I stopped, because I'm a curious man and a stupid one, and because some part of me still didn't believe Petrov, still needed to see it with my own eyes to make it real. The way I'd needed to go down into the slip. I went in. That was the choice. Petrov had given me the exit, and I'd turned around and walked the other way, toward the tanks, because I couldn't stand to leave without knowing. And I will tell you that I have asked myself 100 times whether I went in out of conscience, to see if anyone in those tanks could be helped, or out of nothing better than the same dumb compulsion that makes a man slow down to look at a wreck on the highway. I've never been able to answer it honestly. I think it was the wreck. I think I went in to look, and I've dressed it up as conscience ever since, and I'm done dressing it up. The tanks were behind glass, like she'd drawn them. A row of them, holding tanks the size of phone booths, each one full of that clear, cold blue water, each one lit faintly from below. And in them were the ones the cold had sent partway back. I'm not going to describe them the way a horror story would, because the real thing wasn't gory. It was worse than gory. They were people. They were just people, with wet hair hanging straight down in the water, and their hands flat against the glass, and their eyes open, and their mouths working slowly like they were trying to say something the water wouldn't carry. They weren't decayed. They weren't monsters. They looked cold and tired and unbearably sad, exactly the way my daughter had said. And when I came into the room, every one of them turned to face me and pressed their hands flatter against the glass. And the tapping started, all of them at once, the sound I'd been hearing for a month. And it wasn't asking to be let in. It was asking to be let out. And in the last tank, the one at the end, was Royce. He still had his uniform shirt on, the aquarium logo on the breast, dark with water. His big, slow, kind face behind the glass, his hands flat, his mouth working. He'd told me the tapping was somebody asking to be let in, and then he'd gone quiet and kept his pension and checked the latch twice. And somewhere in the last month, the management of the league had decided Royce was a loose end after all. Or Royce had looked at the slip one time too many. Or the cold had simply taken him because it could. And now Royce was behind the glass with the others, cold and partway back, tapping. That was when I understood that there was no version of being quiet that kept you safe. Royce had been quiet for years, and the glass had him anyway. Being Royce wasn't a survival strategy. It was just a slower way of ending up in the tank. Halverson came in behind me. I heard her before I saw her, that brisk, professional walk. And she stood in the doorway with a clipboard, an actual clipboard, doing rounds, checking the tanks the way I checked the pumps. And she looked at me, standing there in front of Royce's tank with the tapping filling the room. And she said, in the same tone she'd used to remember my name and forget everything I said, You shouldn't be in here. The cold's not stable tonight. I asked her if Royce was alive. It was a stupid question, and she treated it like one. She said alive wasn't the relevant category. She said he was preserved, which was her whole job, and that he was comfortable, which I don't believe, and I don't think she believed either. And that I needed to leave the wing because opening the door this much let the temperature drift, and the temperature mattered more than anything. The temperature was the only thing standing between the part-way ones and a full opening. And here is where the system failure became a real thing, with real consequences in front of my eyes, instead of an idea Petrov had described. Because while she was talking, an alarm went off. The quarantine temperature alarm, the one I'd silenced a dozen times. And the readout on the panel by the door, the one I could see over her shoulder, said the cold tanks were warming. Not cooling, warming. The water in the tanks was climbing toward 50, toward 60, the chillers losing the fight. And Halverson turned and looked at the panel. And for the first time in all the months I'd worked there, I saw her stop being brisk. I saw her be afraid. She said the slip had drained too far. She said the door was open, and the cold was going home, and it was taking its temperature with it, draining out of the building, out of the tanks, and that when the tanks warmed up the part-way, ones wouldn't be preserved anymore. They'd be loose, and they'd want out. And the only thing that had ever kept them behind the glass was the cold. She told me to help her. She told me there was a backup chiller, a big industrial unit in the gallery, that could be patched into the quarantine loop, that it was a job for 2 people, that she couldn't do the valves and the electrical alone in time, and that if we didn't get the tanks cold again in the next 20 minutes, the glass wouldn't hold them. She said it as a colleague. She said it the way you'd ask the maintenance tech to help you fix a pump, because to her, that's what I was. I was the man who knew the valves and the electrical. I was useful and quiet, exactly like Petrov said. And I had a choice. I want to lay it out exactly as it was, because everything I am now lives inside this choice. I could help her. I could go down to the gallery with her and patch in the backup chiller and refrigerate the tanks and keep Royce and the wet-haired people frozen behind the glass, preserved, comfortable in her word, sad and tapping forever. And in doing that, I'd keep the door manageable and keep the cold from coming up through the floor and keep my daughter, across town, safe in her bed. That was the option that kept the system running. That was the option that made me Royce, made me a keeper, made me a man who spends the rest of his life refrigerating the part-way dead, so the world outside never has to know there's a door. Or I could let it warm. I could walk out, get in my car, drive to my daughter, and let the tanks come up to temperature and let the glass fail. And let whatever was going to happen, happen in a building full of people who'd built their lives on keeping it quiet. I didn't know what letting it warm would do. Halverson said it would open the door all the way. Petrov had said the only ones in danger were the ones in the building. I had no way to know which of them was lying or whether either of them understood it any better than I did. I chose to leave. I told Halverson I'd go down and start the backup chiller. I told her to get the valves ready on her end. And I walked out of the research wing and I went down to the gallery and I stood in front of the big industrial backup chiller, the one that could have saved them. And I did not turn it on. I turned it off at the breaker instead, so it couldn't be started. And then I broke the handle off the main isolation valve on the chiller loop, so it couldn't be patched in even by hand. And I did all of this calmly, with tools I'd used 100 times, the way I'd done maintenance for 11 months. Except this time, I was doing the opposite of maintenance. I was making sure the cold could not come back. And the whole time I did it, I could hear the tapping coming down through the building, faster now, and over it the quarantine alarm. And somewhere up there, Halverson, realizing the chiller wasn't coming on, calling my name down the stairwell, and I didn't answer. I told myself it was for my daughter. I told myself that keeping the system running meant a row of suffering people behind glass forever, and a door that would only ever open wider, that the management of the leak was just a slow surrender, that Royce had been quiet for years and ended up in the tank anyway, that there was no good option, and I'd picked the one that ended it. I told myself all of that, and some of it might even be true. But the honest center of it is that I was a man who wanted to go home to his kid, and I made the choice that let me leave, and I dressed it as mercy. And I broke a valve so that 12 people behind glass would warm up, and the glass would fail. And I do not know to this day what happened to them when it did, because I did not stay to see. I went up the stairs. The research wing door was sealed again. I could hear Halverson behind it, and I could hear the tapping behind it, much louder now, no longer patient. And I could hear Petrov somewhere calling for the chiller in that flat voice that had finally lost its calm. I went to the loading dock. The door was latched, the way Royce had started latching it, and I unlatched it, and I went out into the cold November air and the parking lot and the ordinary world. And behind me, the building was lit up and full of sound, and nobody outside it had any idea. And I got in my car, and I drove away, and I did not call anyone. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do, because the official version handled the rest, and the official version is a lie I let stand. I didn't call 911. I didn't call my supervisor. I didn't tell anyone what was in that building. I drove home, and I sat in my apartment, and I waited. And around 4 in the morning, the news started reporting a fire at the aquarium. A chiller system electrical fire contained to the research wing, no public areas affected. By morning, the story was that an industrial refrigeration unit had failed catastrophically and caused a fire and a flood. That the research wing was a loss. That 2 staff members were unaccounted for, and 1 was confirmed dead. A security guard, who must have been caught in it during his rounds. Royce. They found Royce's body in the wreckage, and they wrote that he died in a fire. And his family buried him as a man who died in a fire. And I let them, because the alternative was telling them he'd been behind glass, for I don't know how long before that. Tapping. And that I'd walked past his tank and chosen not to keep him cold. The 2 unaccounted for were Halverson and Petrov. They never found them. The story is that they were consumed in the fire and the flood, and that there wasn't enough left to recover. And the building was condemned and eventually demolished, and the site sat empty. And as far as I know, it's still empty. A fenced lot on the waterfront with the old slipway still under it. The door still down there, draining the wrong way, with no one left to manage the leak because I broke the valve and walked out. I gave a statement. The investigators came to all of us who'd worked there. I told them I'd done my rounds and left at the end of my shift and know nothing about it, which lined up with the badge records, because my badge had logged me out at the loading dock at the right time. I told them the chiller had been giving us trouble, which was true, and that I'd filed tickets about water problems in the sump, which was also true and which they could find in the system. And I let them conclude that I was a diligent maintenance tech whose warnings had gone unheeded by a management that cut corners on safety, which is a clean and ordinary kind of story that everyone understood and nobody questioned. I am, in the official record, one of the people who tried to warn them. That's the version that survived. That's the version that closed my ticket. Except this time, the lie protected me instead of them. My daughter stopped having the dream. That part is true, and it's the part I hold on to on the nights I can't sleep. After the fire, after the night I broke the valve, she stopped waking up talking about the people behind the glass. The wet hair, the cold, the man who isn't a man, who stands behind me at work. All of it stopped. Whatever Petrov said about the door finishing its opening, about the young ones not being needed as a route anymore, something in it was true. Because the connection that had been reaching across town to my 5-year-old went quiet the same week the building burned. She's 7 now. She doesn't remember any of it. She remembers the aquarium as the place Daddy used to work, the place with the tunnel, and she asks sometimes why it closed. And I tell her there was a fire, which is true, and that nobody got hurt, which is the lie I'll tell her until I die. So I survived. I kept my daughter. I kept my custody days, all 3 of them. And I have spent every one of them since trying to be the kind of father who deserved to come home. And I want to believe I am. And on the good days, I almost do. I did the thing I built my whole life around. I went home to her. But I need you to understand what I carry, because survival, in my case, was not a reward, and it was not luck, and it was not courage. I made a choice in front of a panel of 12 cold tanks, and the choice was between being the man who refrigerates the suffering forever to keep the world quiet, and the man who breaks the valve and walks out and lets them warm and never finds out what crawled out of the glass when they did. I told myself there was no good option, and maybe there wasn't. But I didn't choose the lesser evil out of some careful moral reasoning. I chose the one that let me go home. Everything I've said since about mercy, about ending the cycle, about Royce ending up in the tank anyway, all of it came after. All of it is a man building a structure to live inside, so he doesn't have to stand in the open with what he actually did. I left Royce behind the glass. He told me the tapping was somebody asking to be let in, and he was the only one who tried to tell me the truth. And I walked past his tank and looked at his big tired face, and then I went downstairs and broke the valve that would have kept him preserved, comfortable in Halverson's word. And I have to live with the fact that I don't know whether I freed him or finished him, because I didn't stay to see, because staying would have meant not going home. I think about the door under the empty lot. I think about the slip draining the wrong way with nobody managing the leak. Petrov said the door had always leaked a little and that for as long as there'd been a building there, people had kept it wet on the right side. And I broke the only system that did that and burned down the only people who knew how. And I don't know what that means for the lot, or the waterfront, or the city, or for the next child somewhere who starts waking up talking about cold people with wet hair pressing their hands against glass. I tell myself the door closed when the building burned. I have no reason to believe that except that I need to. My daughter drew me a picture last week. Just a normal one. A house and a son, and the 2 of us holding hands. The kind kids that age draw by the 1,000. I put it on the refrigerator next to all the others. And I stood there, longer than I should have, looking at the blue she'd used for the sky, because it was the exact cold, clear blue of the water in the slip. And the tanks. The blue that was the wrong color for groundwater. And I know that's nothing. I know it's just a crayon. I know a man can find the door in anything once he's seen it. But I keep that other drawing too, the one with the cold people and the open mouths and the word in backward letters. I keep it in a drawer I don't open. I told you I'd been keeping my own notes, at home, on paper, for some future version of myself who'd be able to prove he wasn't crazy. This is those notes. This is me telling it. And I notice, now that I've reached the end, that proving I'm not crazy was never what I wanted. What I wanted was for someone to tell me I'd had no choice. And I finally understood that nobody can, because I did have one, and I made it, and I'm still here in a warm apartment with my daughter asleep down the hall, which is exactly what I chose over everything else. And that's the punishment, not guilt that fades. The opposite. A good life, the one I built and wanted, lived out every single day on top of a thing I broke and walked away from, with the tapping just quiet enough that most nights I can almost pretend I don't still hear it under the floor.